Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of Echolocation, a podcast created under a joint collaboration between three media outlets from Georgia, Moldova, and Sweden. Our aim is to create an echo-free society by inviting young people from all three countries to make their voice heard, but at the same time exchange information and opinions about all sorts of topics and interests. My name is Rivera from Sweden, and today's topic is drugs. With me here today to discuss this important topic, I have a very informed and engaged panel. Herman Szabo from Georgia, who is a member of the Georgian Parliament and one of the leaders of the Libertarian Party, Girchi.
Hello, pleasure to be part of the podcast.
From Sweden, we have Pierre Andersson, policy advisor for the Swedish think tank Center for Drug Politics, or Narkotikapolitisktcenter in Swedish.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
And from Moldova, we have Dan, who has a personal connection to this issue.
Hi, it's Dan Erusevschi. Thank you for having me on this podcast.
It would be great if you could introduce yourself and maybe also say something brief about today's theme, how it affects you, and when and why have you found an interest in these kinds of questions. Herman, do you want to start?
I work in Georgian Parliament. I'm a member of Parliament and also a member of the Libertarian Classic Liberal Party, Girchi, here. And as a classic liberal, for us, the personal freedom, personal sovereignty, and the independence from the state of the human body is kind of essential. So we've been fighting against the drug wars for several years, and we managed to achieve that in Georgia, the consumption of cannabis is legal. I've personally been a user of several drugs, but just mild user. And I don't have much experience to say from my personal experience, what I have done or something, but I've been closely looking and monitoring the situation which is in Georgia and how the drug policy is changing, how it's used, sometimes in political ways. And I think our experience would be interesting for your listeners. So I'm eager to answer your questions.
Thank you, Herman. And Pierre?
Hi, I am the policy advisor at the Swedish Drug Policy Center. As you said, this is a kind of a think tank. It's network-based. There's a bunch of civil society organizations who are members of this think tank and coming together. And the reason this think tank started in 2019 is as kind of a response to the growing debate around drug policy issues, also in Sweden. We see it all over the world, but it's definitely also in Sweden, and some people's demands around legalization of cannabis and so on. As most people, I have friends, family who have experienced the consequences of both alcohol and other drugs. So I think this is part of the answer why I'm sort of engaged in this issue. I've also have a professional background as a journalist, and I've been covering these issues for a long time. And I think I gained some insights into the importance of having a policy around these issues, having a good policy, having kind of a population-based approach, not only, individual responses and helping people. We need a balance there. And I think we'll come back to this during the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Pierre. And then Dan?
Yes, my relation to drugs is the most direct one. I had been a heroin addict for about 15 years in the past. I've managed to get sober about 5 years ago, so I'm in a successful remission of about 5 years now. I'm acting as a peer counselor at the moment in a rehabilitation center, but not only. So I'm offering counseling to people on all stages of addiction and recovery. So that is my relation to drugs. I'm also writing a book about my own experience covering addiction, of course. I've recently launched a YouTube channel, which is called Overcoming Addiction, related to addiction and recovery.
Thank you. We can start with a quick summary of our different drug policies in our different countries. How is the legislation in Georgia?
The consumption of cannabis is legal in Georgia, but we have judicial cases, you could say, that you can consume cannabis, but there is no legal way to obtain it. So if you don't walk in the park and stumble upon some cannabis and, just to find, there's no legal way to get the cannabis. And it's a kind of strange situation, because if our constitutional court said that the consumption of cannabis is kind of human right of self-development. You can put any substance in your body if it doesn't harm others. So consumption is legal and obtaining is not legal. You cannot grow or buy or accept as a gift or something like that. So that's the easy drugs. And what about the hard drugs? On the contrary of cannabis, on the hard drugs, we have disastrous situation, you could say. There are a huge list of substances which are prosecuted to have, and lots and lots of these substances don't have the minimal dose written in the code. So if you have even the several molecules of some substances, it's almost as having maybe several grams of it. So it's a very bizarre situation, and people have been in jail for having leftovers in the syringe, not some usable dose, but leftovers. And this kind of policy is then used to have an influence on people, on families. So before the elections, they can be pardoned or released from the prison for votes. So it's we have this political layer to this problem also in Georgia. And drugs are not target of doctors, but target of police. That's the quick overview.
Are there many people who are now in jail for these kinds of drug-related crimes?
As far as I know, there are from 15 to 30% of prisoners who are sitting either for having or selling 16 years, 18 years, 10 years, 11 years. That's a common sentences for even having minimal amounts of several substances, which, as I mentioned, don't have the minimal dose in the criminal code.
And how does this compare to Moldova? Do you have similar policies, or?
There is a big difference because, as opposed to Georgia, where cannabis is already legal, nothing is legal in Moldova. So the policy of the state is basically a punitive one. It's based on punishment. There is nothing related to recovery or helping people who are struggling with addiction, for example. If you are suspected of consuming drugs and you do not have anything in your possession, you are taken by the police to this place called the Narkotikapolitisktcenter dispensary, where you have to give a sample of your urine to be tested for having drugs in your body. If you do, you are put on a list, on a common register, where you are branded as a consumer or an addict. So there are two categories of people who take drugs. This basically doesn't influence your life too much, but it will be a barrier for obtaining a driver's license, for obtaining a weapon, but it doesn't really affect anybody's life. So you can get a job, you can study, these things are not affected. If you are caught with anything in your possession, it will start with fines up to prison time. One of the biggest problems we have are the quantities of drugs. Anything above 2.5 grams is considered extremely high. So if you are caught with 2.6 grams of heavy drugs, you will be punished the same as being caught with 2 tons of drugs. So if you are caught in your possession with 2.6 grams of hard drugs, you are facing a prison time from 3 to 7 years. If we are talking about drug trafficking, if you are caught with anything, with hard drugs above 2.5 grams, you're looking at 7 to 15 years of prison time. There is no alternative punishment in Moldova. I know there's a process of revising all these policies, but it is very slow, and the government is not really open to looking for alternatives.
Pierre, Swedish drug policy, how do you think it differs from Moldova and Georgia?
Well, I think it differs in a couple of ways. There are some similarities. I mean, Sweden, as most countries in the world, follow the UN conventions. That means that we have legislation in place that prohibits the possession and sale of all narcotic drugs outside of medical use, like almost every other country does. When it comes to the actual sentences for like larger possession and the sales of drugs, according to the EMCDDA statistics, this is the EU Narcotics Board, right? According to their statistics, we are somewhere in the middle, like close to the mean of the other European countries. We also prohibit the use of narcotic drugs in Sweden. So similarly to, I think, your countries, or at least Georgia, the police has the right to check like urine sample or blood sample if they suspect narcotic use. We do not practice prison sentences at all when it comes to the personal use of drugs or small possessions. It's all financial fines for those kind of minor offenses. Now, it's important to say that in Sweden, the accessibility of treatment and care it's not as good as I would like it to be, but it's there. Everyone with a drug use disorder has a legal right to treatment. It's generally possible to get it, right? The problem we have is that there is and has been a gap between our general healthcare system and the local municipalities when it comes to who is paying for this, who is responsible for this. Now, this gap is being looked at by the government, and there are processes in place to hopefully fix that side of the problem.
As we have been talking about, there's things that obviously don't work with our different systems, but maybe there are stuff that works as well. What do you think, Dan, in Moldova? Is there anything that is good with the system, or should everything change?
The only good thing I can think of at the moment is the existence of a drug rehabilitation center within a prison in Moldova. So that's quite the innovation for us. It was very difficult to make it happen. It happened with the help of the Pompidou Group of the Council of Europe. It's quite the phenomenon, and many other more developed countries, they don't have that. So even those countries are looking up to us and seeking expertise. And I'm living proof of its benefits because I've been one of the beneficiaries. I underwent a drug rehabilitation program within prison. So I'm one person who definitely benefited from it. What I really would like to see is an alternative punishment offered. I can use the example of the UK, where I have also been detained, struggling with the same problems. I saw recovery or drug treatment services being integrated into the justice system. So that is, as far as I'm concerned, that's a very good practice. In the courtroom, you are given the opportunity to undergo treatment instead of receiving a prison sentence.
Pierre, what do you think?
I think one thing to consider in the Swedish context is that we generally have quite low, or in some cases very low prevalence numbers for use of narcotic drugs compared to other countries. If you look at, again, European statistics or global statistics, we end up quite far down the list, so to speak. This is true for most drugs. When it comes to cocaine, amphetamine, we are a little bit in the middle of the European statistics, but generally it's quite low. And this tells me that we are doing something right. I think the policy we have is part of the answer. This is why I don't support a general decriminalization of drugs in Sweden. I think laws actually help keeping prevalence low. That being said, I think the UK example that was brought up here is great. I think Sweden too could have alternatives to penalties when it comes to people with drug use disorder. We could realistically do this without general decriminalization. We could do it within the kind of framework that we have to make sure that people with a drug use disorder should not automatically be fined for these minor offenses. They could be offered treatment instead, right? So that's one example. I think we have a problem with high numbers when it comes to drug overdoses. I think we need to do a lot there. Naloxone, the counter drug or whatever you call it, to help in these cases is now being distributed more, but I think we could do much more in that area. I also think we could change the law so that people who actually call police, ambulance in overdose cases are not under the risk of being punished for any drugs that may still be on the living room table or whatever in that case. People should not be afraid to call the ambulance in overdose cases. So I think we could have like a special case law in those instances. Other than that, I think access to real treatment, real recovery could really be improved. But I think there are some things happening in that field in Sweden today.
Herman, in Georgia, what do you think should change or what should you keep with your current system?
I could try to think of maybe two examples. One is the changes we have seen recently, and our friend from Sweden mentioned about the naloxone, which is the anti-opiate overdose drug. You couldn't buy it in the pharmacy. You needed a prescription for that. And this small crazy law took several lives before our government, with our activity, our party's activity, made a change recently, maybe 6 months ago or something, after famous cameraman of one of the TV stations have died. Another positive thing our drug policy has is a opiate replacement program. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly in English, but when government is registering the drug addicts and giving them the doses to replace the heavier drugs with the more clean and harmless alternatives. But the problem with this replacement program is that we have about 50,000 heavy drug addicts in Georgia, and maybe 30% of them are in these programs. This situation created even worse outcome when people who are in program, when they are given this replacement drug, they don't swallow and they take it out, sell it or something like that. Other than these two positive things, we could say that Georgia needs really a dramatic shift in the approach of drug war, because right now it's a totally police-centered, punishment-centered policy we have. We as a party are, despite not like Mr. Pierre said, we are for the total decriminalization. We think that many of the bad things which come with drugs is thanks to criminalization and thanks to situation when police is chasing the users or dealers or whoever are involved in this case. And with the criminalization and with this expanding this replacement, and opioid replacement programs and stuff like that, you could really eradicate almost all the problems, not all of them, but majority of the problems we now can imagine when thinking about drugs. One small good thing, what happened recently, maybe not recently, but 10 years ago, something like that. Right now, the ambulance is not obliged to call the police when they are called for the drug overdose. And before that, it was mandatory. Like previous government had this policy where if you had overdose and you call the ambulance, they were coming together with the police, which is such a non-human thing to do. And this thing also changed. Other than these 2 or 3 small things, I could remember the rest of Georgia's drug policy is a horrible place for drug users to be.
Pierre, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add the perspective of prevention into this discussion as well. I do think it's an important part of drug policy. It's something that is not often discussed. We have seen that resources towards prevention activities has actually declined in Sweden over the last 10, 15 years, which is really unfortunate. Some municipalities do a great job when it comes to preventing these problems. They don't prevent everything, of course, but they really make a difference. And if we could kind of pick the best methods and make this systematically throughout the country, I think it would make a big difference. I mean, in the long run, we really want to prevent as much of the harm from drugs from the beginning, from the get-go, right? It's certainly the most effective way.
Do you have an example, some kind of prevention policy that you think maybe has worked or could work?
Yeah, I don't know how much detail we can go into, but the key here seems to be that different groups really come together and cooperate. So the police cooperate very closely with the social services. They cooperate very closely with schools. You know, they do a lot of things for young people before it really goes wrong. And I would say to do this in a coordinated way, in a humane way, in a way that really focuses on the future of these young kids, instead, not punishment, but really helping them to a better future. And doing this in the way they do it really seems to make a lot of difference.
I read this report from Our World in Data, where they compared number of overdose-related deaths in different countries. In that you can see that Georgia and Moldova has quite a low number when it comes to deaths related to amphetamine and opioids and cocaine, and much lower than Sweden, and also lower than the neighboring countries. Why do you think that is? Start with Dan.
As far as Moldova is concerned, the answer is very simple. Moldova does not have an official registry of overdose-related deaths. So in lots of cases, the cause of death is officially cardiac arrest. Plus, Moldova is a relatively small country. So according to our official statistics, we have about 12,000 registered drug users, and most of them are intravenous users of hard drugs. So that might be one of the reasons, because according to UNODC, the real number is 3 times bigger, so it's about 36,000. But still, that is a relatively small number. So I think we can combine these 2 factors, that we are relatively a small country with a relatively small number of hard drug users. Plus, we do not officially register these deaths as overdoses.
I think it's really, really difficult to make a comparison between countries when it comes to drug-related deaths. As Dan says and alludes to, there are quite a lot of countries with significant underreporting in this area. And even with countries that have these registers in place, there are differences into methodology. There are differences into what equipment authorities have access to. There are a lot of difference in, how many deaths actually lead to autopsies or this kind of chemical analysis that is needed. There are so many differences that I think it's actually really, really difficult to use these lists for anything meaningful. That being said, the number for Sweden is really high, and it's too high. We need to get it down, but I'm not at all sure that we, in reality, are as high on the list as it seems to be.
Why do you think people use drugs in general?
There couldn't be one answer to that question. Some people do drugs because of the halo the drug use has, as it's been cool or something heroic or against the system or some rebellious thing when you're young. For some people, it's a curiosity. For some people, it's a way to escape the harsh reality. And especially in the poor countries like Georgia or Moldova, it could be a safe place, so to say. For me, the drug use was a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of environment in which I was growing up.
Dan, what do you think? Why do people use drugs, and how should we see drug users?
I have two totally different approaches towards drug use and drug addiction. If we were to talk about drug addiction, it's always about emotional pain, emotional discomfort. So it may seem like people are seeking pleasure. They're not. They're actually seeking a relief, an escape, a numbing of a certain discomfort. If we are to talk about drug use, I think this is valid for a lot of cases of drug use, but it's not 100%. So from my experience, I know people who are very functional, have a great quality of life, basically have a very good position in society, and they are able to do light drugs every now and then. That does not affect their life in any way. So I think the majority of drug use is more of a relief seeking, of a numbing of a certain discomfort. That's my personal perspective of this. So,
Pierre, do you agree with this position?
I think there is a lot of truth to this. I think it's a really difficult question to answer. When people first start using drugs, it's probably a lot to do with curiosity, maybe peer pressure, maybe a very allowing attitude towards certain drugs in your area, or a high availability of drugs in your area. I think when people then get into using drugs, I think some people really do it because they experience some positive effects from this. Often it might be connected to relief, as Dan says, or other mental health issues, not always, but sometimes. I do think that we need to kind of raise the discussion also to a sort of population level. There might well be people who can, like, in quotation marks, handle cannabis without coming into a drug use disorder or whatever. But we do know that the higher the use of drugs in the society is, the more problems we will see, the more people will experience drug-induced psychosis or drug use disorder. So, I mean, we really need to kind of have both the individual perspective and the society perspective on this. And I think that's sometimes missing.
Do you think there's a lot of stigma around using drugs?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stigma around using drugs. It's becoming better in Sweden, I would say, but society as a whole still needs to do better when it comes to not judging people for having a drug use disorder. I think we can do things smarter here. I really want to stress and be clear on that this is generally not a hindrance. I mean, the legislation we have in Sweden is not a hindrance for people to seek treatment. It's available for everyone. No one will call the police because, drugs are illegal when you seek treatment, right? The treatment from healthcare staff, the treatment from police, the treatment from social services, the treatment from other people in society could certainly be better. This is not necessarily, an issue of criminal status. There's a lot of stigma also around alcohol use disorder in Sweden. Alcohol is legal in Sweden. It's widely used, but there's a lot of stigma around alcohol use disorder anyway.
Okay, we will get into alcohol later, actually. But first, I want to ask you, Herman, how do you think the stigma is around using drugs in Georgia?
There has been a huge stigma around the drug use in Georgia, especially in older generation. For example, my party has been advocate for releasing the harsh drug policy for several years, and the main critique we hear from the older generation is that we are drug addicts, and it ends the conversation with that. So if they have that kind of approach.
And Dan?
I've actually been lucky enough not to face any type of discrimination personally. I don't know why. I've just been lucky, I guess. But I would say there's still a lot of stigma around drug use in Moldova. It's familiar, as Herman said, as the situation in Georgia. I think it's a cultural thing. It's getting a bit better, and the newer generations are becoming more open-minded towards drugs and drug use. But the older generations, unfortunately, they don't change their position. We even have a saying in Moldova: there are no ex-addicts. It's a stigma that follows a person until the day he leaves this earth. I was participating in a seminar where a new application was being launched. Through this application, the police could refer to certain services like drug counseling and stuff like that. So when they were receiving the training, I overheard the discussion in the room. They were really cynical about it, that these people do not deserve the effort. That was the general attitude in the room. So you can tell there's still a lot of stigma, and the attitude is still very judgmental, and it's still pretty much a close, dark subject. But as I said previously, the newer generations will change it a little bit.
We have this stigma around drugs, and we have these very preventative policies. But at the same time, alcohol and tobacco is also highly addictive, and alcoholism is definitely a huge problem in society in general. And still, we don't look at it the same way. And here in Sweden, sometimes feel that there's a stigma not to drink. I don't know if you agree with that view, Pierre.
Oh, it's a great point. We have a very strong alcohol norm in Sweden. I think around 90% of the adult population uses alcohol on a regular basis. So it's not everyone, but it's certainly most of people. And as you say, there is a norm around it, and not following that norm is sometimes difficult for people. I think it's different when it comes to alcohol use and people who have alcohol use disorder. I think there's a lot of stigma around alcohol use disorder, similar to the one that exists around drug use disorder. So there are similarities, but when it comes to use, there's a strong norm on using alcohol in Sweden.
Herman, how is it in Georgia?
Actually, we consider Georgia to be the birthplace of the wine. So here, the wine drinking culture is really big. Not like Sweden, where it's more maybe harder liquors, some vodka maybe or something. We also have similar to vodka, this chacha, Georgian grappa, but the stigma is around the wine drinking. You're not a full man if you don't drink wine at the supras, at the gatherings we have, with the tamada saying a really long toast and stuff like that. But I don't have data about how problematic it is. Maybe I don't have data because it's not that problematic. Also, I remember when in the health committee there was a report about alcohol and tobacco usage amongst kids they said that it's around 10-15%. So it's not that big a problem. We have tradition of drinking a little bit. Even small children are given a little bit of wine during the feasts, or maybe even on a daily basis. But we don't have that much alcohol problem like more northern countries. Like in Russia, it's a huge problem.
How is it in Moldova then?
I don't have any official figures. What I do know is that alcohol consumption in Moldova is extremely high. And as far as I'm concerned, we have one of the top places in Europe. It's very similar to Georgia. We have a very widespread wine making culture and the production of personal stronger drinks. How does it affect the country? From my personal experience, while I was being detained in several prisons here, the majority of the people detained in prison have committed their crimes while consuming alcohol or as a result of consuming alcohol. So I'm not sure you will be able to find any official statistics linking these crimes to alcohol, but I do know that for a fact. So another point of view might be the increase of people dying as a result of car crashes and a rise in drink and drive cases. It's a huge problem at the moment. We have a big increase of people dying on the roads, like in car accidents or just pedestrians being hit by cars. And lots of cases, it's linked to alcohol consumption. So that's a huge problem.
If we talk about what Pierre said, if we separate normal alcohol use with problematic alcohol use, do you think it's a big stigma around the problematic alcohol use in Moldova?
Yes, well, of course, alcohol addiction is regarded pretty much as badly as drug addiction because it has pretty much the same consequences. So I guess the stigma is pretty much the same. From another point of view, if we talk about normal consumption, again, as my own personal experience, because I'm a recovering addict, I do not consume any type of substances whatsoever at the moment. So whenever I'm in certain social situations, people find it very bizarre, like really bizarre, that I don't drink alcohol at all. Like even beer, wine and stuff, like not even a little. So there is a strong belief among people that a little bit of alcohol is really healthy and a little bit of wine is really healthy and a little bit of a stronger spirit is really healthy if it's a moderate consumption. So people find it really, really bizarre that I do not consume. So I guess that the consumption of alcohol is a norm in Moldova.
I want to finish this episode by asking you for some advice. If any of our listeners have a friend or a family member or a co-worker or etc. who is using drugs or alcohol in an abusive and a problematic way, do you have any advice for them how to help?
I would say start by talking to someone you trust. I think talking about these issues could help a lot, but then seek help if you feel you need it. Talk to your medical doctor and take it from there.
Herman, do you have any advice?
Yeah, the main thing, the starting point for every drug user who needs help is to, I hope in your country, in your county, in your region, there's some services where you could help your friend or family member to approach and get some medical help, because self-medicating and self going through sometimes it's not that effective. So I would suggest you to do what I did for my friend who had the same kind of problem. First, we talked a lot, and as soon as he confessed and as soon as he understood, realized that he needed help, then you could offer a shoulder to rely on.
And then, as a recovering addict yourself, do you have any special recommendation and advice?
Yes, I certainly do. I'll start with the fact that you cannot help a person that does not want to be helped. So that's the first rule that everybody should understand. Regardless of how much effort you will put into saving a person who suffers from addiction, you will achieve absolutely nothing if that person is not on board. So what we should do in these types of situation is communicate the solution to this person. So we should mention that there is a drug rehabilitation center, or we should mention the place, the specialized institution where they can get help. And then the approach is called harsh love, where we should help the person face the consequences of the drug abuse, of the addiction. So we should not in any way assist or support the drug use by giving money, by solving their problems with the police, with the loan sharks, and any other related things. So inform the person that there is a solution, there is a place where they can get help, and then afterwards help this person face the consequences of the use. Because as practice shows, a person starts seeking help when he reaches the bottom of the barrel, if I can say that. And the bottom is different for every person. So for someone, this bottom might be a divorce when he loses his loved ones. For another person might be prison. For another might be losing an arm because of bad injection experience. We need to help the person who struggles with drug use face the consequences, and only then they start moving towards light.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I just want to add that there's a lot of resources online. And if I'm correct, you have a YouTube channel as well, as you mentioned.
Yes. I've recently launched it. It has only one video. It's my personal experience, but I will be posting episodes weekly.
I want to personally thank our incredible guest, Dan Erusevschi from Moldova. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank Pierre Andersson from Sweden.
Thank you.
And Herman Szabo from Georgia.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. And I hope we learned something new, and that this very important conversation will continue in our 3 different countries. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Remember to subscribe to Echolocation and follow us on Instagram for sound bites and extra material. You can also find older episodes on interesting topics such as sports, politics, artificial intelligence. And until next time, be careful and be safe.